to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's my privilege to have as my guest W Bertolotti of the Perennial Leader Project. Josh is the host of In Search of Wisdom, which is one of my favorite podcasts. He's a coach and he's a lover of wisdom. In this episode, we're going to have a rich conversation about reading the works of the ancients and doing a deep dive into the great thinkers of the past so we can learn how to live wisely, to live well. He talks about the importance of developing self-awareness, especially among leaders, and also the importance of forgiveness in the good life. You're going to love this conversation. Let's jump into the interview. Welcome, Josh, to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. It's so great to have you as my guest today.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Good to connect with you, Brian.
And just to get things started the way I like to with all my guests, can you share a few key moments in your life and maybe even your spiritual journey, if you're comfortable, that led you to today where you serve as a podcast host, your coach, and I would consider you a teacher of wisdom with all the content that you put out?
Well, I appreciate it. A little uncomfortable with the teacher of wisdom part, but yeah, I spent my adult life in the military. I kind of grew up in a small town in South Florida. Didn't really travel much or see much of the world until joining the Air Force. And shortly after getting to my first base, I was probably, around 20 or so, something like that. There was a member of my unit at the time who took his own life. Individual was probably around 25 or so at the time. Not someone that I knew particularly well, but someone I looked up to, was really competent at their job, seemed to have everything going for them. So it was a real shock to me, and it left me thinking about life and coming to the realization that it's a bit more complex than I realized, and it's a different experience for all of us. But I would say that particular experience probably started me on a journey to asking some of these perennial questions of maybe how one leads a good life and avoid suffering or navigate suffering in life.
And when we first connected, I think because you invited me to be on your podcast, and I think you'd seen some of my tweets about, I quote Seneca and sometimes Epictetus a lot. I think that's how we originally connected. Can you talk a little bit about your interest in Stoicism in general? And
Sure. It's always hard to pinpoint when, at least it is for me, when you particularly find something. But I don't know if you remember when Kindles and things like that first became a thing. But I remember being an early adopter and getting one of those, and all the older books were free.
Yeah.
So, and I think I probably had some sort of curiosity around wisdom then, but I remember, and you can kind of look back and see, because they're still in your Kindle library and when it was downloaded and things like that. But one of those was a book by Epictetus, the Enchiridion. So that might have spurred it. But another thing, I guess, similar to around that time that I just mentioned, of that young man taking his own life, my grandmother passed away shortly after that, or within a year after that, and was someone who lived a long, good life, but really embodied what I would call a joyful life all the way to the end. And you think about, people in their 80s, the pain and the physical ailments and things like that, and to be able to smile and laugh and embody joy through some of that, it was really intrigued me. And I think that connects with Stoicism for me, or was the initial entry point of finding joy in the face of adversity.
You have is Epictetus or Epictetus? I don't even know how you say his name. I heard, so you probably got the
Me
right
either.
one. So is he your favorite Stoic, or do you have a preference for any of them in particular?
No, probably my favorite is Seneca. It might be just based on the massive amounts of content, and also I like the letters. Seeing this exchange, I think, is pretty cool. But Marcus Aurelius is a close second. I'm a huge fan of Meditations.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I found out about Stoicism. I guess I was listening to Tim Ferriss podcast, and he was talking a lot about Seneca's letters, and I found that for myself, even going through my own difficult time, I found and I was also in a new job. It was very stressful when I was dean. And I found that the Stoics to sort of be these people with skin in the game that knew how to navigate without freaking out about the external stuff. So I found them super helpful. So I was just curious how you connected with that. Now your podcast, and by the way, everyone's listening should check out Josh's podcast, In Search of Wisdom. He's had fantastic guests. He's a great interviewer. It's called In Search of Wisdom. Love that title. And I know you always ask folks, or I don't know if you ask everybody. I haven't listened to every episode, but you often ask people what they think, what their understanding of wisdom is, in a specific way. But like from all these interviews that you've done in your own, in your own search for wisdom, what would you say have been some of maybe your key takeaways, or even surprising takeaways about what it means to live wisely today in the 21st century?
Well, I greatly appreciate the kind words, and I appreciate you being a guest on the show previously. Um, I'm about 75 episodes in or so, and it's still somewhat of a difficult question for me for me to answer. Um, so there's many different definitions, but I think some of the things, or the takeaways for me personally, that I think are applicable to others in daily life. And I'm really after a practical sense of wisdom, a rubber meets the road, if you will. But some of these key lessons obviously show up in various different traditions, and they're maybe communicated a different way, which I think helps. It helps me, as we were chatting before the show, as somebody that follows the Christian path. I think of, say, the practice of forgiveness, for example. You think of Jesus on the cross stating, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." I tend to think in, how do you do that?
Yeah.
It's when I come at that, it's a very difficult thing. But if you look back, you can see Socrates, through the writing of Plato, talking about the same thing. No one knowingly does evil. It's simply just a lack of wisdom in that particular moment. Thomas Aquinas, Marcus Aurelius, who we just mentioned, I would say Seneca. There are many people that say the same thing. And I think hearing some of that in different ways, communicated slightly different, can maybe, at least for me, maybe get a bit deeper in your bones, that everyone wants to do well. Any sort of, evil or wrongdoing that we may see, that should be seen through a lens of compassion.
No, that's good. I actually loved it. If that's the key takeaway, I think that's awesome. Are there other things that jump out to you from your own study of wisdom beyond forgiveness? But I love how you started with that. And again, I don't think this isn't going to come out during Holy Week, but we're literally recording this during Holy Week, and you're talking about Jesus on the cross, so that's pretty cool too. Yeah.
Yeah. I think another thing that comes up is something that you, I believe, talked about on the podcast, but as I've also heard it in a number of your other episodes. If we think of, say, the Jesus prayer, for example, this idea of having mercy on me, a sinner, but you also stress the importance of this second prayer that you talk about, of allow me to accept the things about myself regardless of how beautiful they are. And I may have butchered that a bit, but this idea of these different poles, of maybe seeing a broader perspective, it seems like there's a tendency, we're viewing these paths maybe as Robert Frost talks about in The Road Not Taken. Here's two, here's this way. But oftentimes it's this both and, or maybe Aristotle talks about a golden mean. The Buddha would say the middle way. It's almost like there's a road not there that you have to navigate and deal with this uncertainty in both and I'm a huge fan of Richard Rohr as well, this idea of yes and but I think that has been a consistent theme that shows up in some of these conversations as well.
Yeah, just speaking with you, and again, I'm on your email list and I get to read some of your essays. You're always pulling things together from so many great thinkers, heavily invested in ancient thinkers, and you've just been whipping off one after another as we've been talking. And then you did a lot of, there's other modern thinkers too. So talk a little bit about how, I mean, your own reading practices. How have you been able to pull from all of these different traditions or paths? And is that, and how long has it taken you to get to the place now where you seem like you are just almost effortlessly able to pull all of these different traditions together? What's that looked like for you as this walk that you started when you were said you were 20?
Well, those are kind words, and it's probably not put together as eloquently as it could. But
But you're in the game there, Josh, and it's not too many
yeah.
people actually are.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm a bit obsessive, I guess, if you will, which could be a virtue. It could be a vice as well. But I tend to follow these rabbit holes,
Mm,
if you will. Um, I remember initially starting out reading a lot about positive psychology
mhm.
and things like that, and then a lot about leadership. And maybe more recently in the last 5 years, philosophy and things like that. I've also went through a time of Thomas Merton and Thomas Keating, which I come back to, and things like that. But I think the more you read, many of the books that you read, and in yours, which is phenomenal, there's a lot of wisdom in there from various different traditions. And I don't know, sometimes it just connects the dot, and maybe make a little mental note. Thankfully, things like Kindle, you can highlight and go back to things and make notes and all of that type of stuff.
No, I just love that. I think I think it is right. That's one of the beauty of commitment to lifelong learning. You just start getting these serendipitous kind of moments over the years, and things do start to connect. And that's, you have to experience the reading and the study, but you'll always hit these moments where it seems like things just come together at different points in fresh ways. And I mean, I clearly see that in your work. It's one of the reasons I appreciate it so much. Um, Talking about your own the organization that you're part of, that you founded, the Perennial Leader Project. Again, I love that phrase too, the Perennial Leader. Great name. What's a perennial leader, and how would we know it if we saw one?
That's another good question. um, the meaning to me of a perennial leader is maybe for some not so inspiring. If you think of this idea of true self, false self, maybe the false self doesn't necessarily like this idea of a perennial leader, or some sort of path where there's no end, there's nothing to climb, there's no one to compete with, and things like that. Um, Maybe an example, like if you think of, I think there's these illusions. And I love how you talk of the unholy trinity. And if I remember right, fear, guilt, and shame.
Yeah. Yes.
In a lot of traditions, we'll talk about these things as like illusions. We're not really seeing clearly. Um, but think about like the illusion of success, which really maybe doesn't sit well with the false self. But if you were to ask somebody, like, who painted the Sistine Chapel? Who invented the light bulb? These type of questions, it's quick responses of Michelangelo, Thomas Edison, all of that. But you look at it, a little deeper, peel the onion back, and then it's like, well, yes, it was Michelangelo and a team of, I think, a whole nother dozen people. And in the way of Edison, yes, it was Edison, and then a team of a whole nother, like almost 50 people that were just part of the team. And then there's just all this connection type of deal. So it's like this illusion of individual success. I've heard you talk about seeing someone with 10,000 people behind them. Love that. How did that come to you? This idea of you're not just seeing this person. And I think sometimes we can think or even set out to achieve success in this way that is kind of an illusion.
Now, I love that. I'd love to just say a little bit more on that, because I know you do some coaching on those things. And again, all of us, I don't know if you were always as collaborative as you are today. I'm going to be 53 in April. I think this podcast will come out before my April 22nd, so for my birthday or whatever. But I look back over my life, and most of the mistakes I've made as a leader is I was trying to achieve something. Some level I was thinking I was doing it for God. I'm not going to say I had bad motives, but it's for, got to get tenure, you need to write a book, blah, blah, blah. Or even as a dean, I need to get all my faculty to do this thing that I think they should do. And then, you learn, hopefully before it's too late. And hopefully I did before it's too late, that you actually, you do need a team, right? And that kind of those are lessons that sort of came later to me. When did you pick that up, and how do you help? There's a lot of pastors that are listening to the podcast, and good, bad, or ugly, not every pastor, they have to lead volunteers, and then some are better than others at actually putting teams together. And a lot of times it just becomes a burden and overwork. It's so easy. It just becomes about kind of this spiritual leader who does everything. So talk about how you got to the point where you learned what real collaboration was, and how the leader could kind of recede and basically deploy a team to achieve something greater. And what's your advice to leaders that maybe come to you for coaching to help them to begin to move out of this great man or great woman who does everything into this person, as you said, that kind of recedes in the background?
My initial response, I want to talk about the idea that I'm not sure that we pick it up. I can say that for myself. I'm not sure that I pick that up. I'm not sure that if we were to collaborate with a group that there wouldn't be that. But I think that is part of it, of realizing that is a bit of an illusion that maybe we just get glimpses of, and coming to the realization that we're not quite seeing it. Like if you think of, say Thomas Merton on the corner of, I can't remember the street, but he gets this insight and this connection with everyone there. I assume that didn't last. Even though he had that particular insight, he probably didn't carry that with him the rest of his life. And I think that's the same truth for us. We can get some of these insights, but that doesn't mean it lasts. It doesn't mean that we're going to be able to really put that into practice on a consistent basis. When I look back at my time being active duty in the military and leading teams, I see much of too much of knowing, too much of, I definitely don't look back and see what I'm talking about as a perennial leader. And I think sometimes that can be a problem if you're reading, say, a traditional leadership book. Sometimes it comes across, and I wouldn't say it does more harm than good, but it might do a little bit of harm potentially, because there's a feeling of knowing. There's a feeling of I, instead of we, our, us, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So what are some of the ways that because I mean, I totally agree with it. I appreciate it. I love even the kind of the self-awareness that you show. And I like the word illusion. And I can tell, I mean, the complexity, it's like, yeah, we don't always get this right. And there's also the challenge of like, okay, I get knowledge, but just because I have knowledge doesn't mean it gets into my hands and my feet and even my mouth so that I can embody these things. So knowing isn't enough. You got to be able to walk the path in some way. So what are some questions that you like to use, or maybe even tools that help draw out enough self awareness out of a person that maybe you're working with who wants to be a better leader, wants to learn more from you, that puts them in a position where they're not just in their head so much? Can you, without trying to share all your secrets to your coaching, but like,
no secrets. I think the question of questions around what do you know for sure? How might you be wrong? Some of these questions that can maybe shed light on that opposite pole that we were talking about with the Jesus prayer
yeah,
and the opposite pole. How can we shed a little bit of light on these two different paths so one might be able to navigate a road that's not necessarily there and find some sort of middle way? But also there's these weird things of desire. Like Lao Tzu has some sort of quote that I remember reading in this book, The Greats on Leadership. I think it's Susan Davis, but she basically writes in there that, stuff from the East, there's only one particular thing from Eastern traditions. And she puts in there that it's basically the advanced version. I was like, oh, what does that mean? But you read this particular Lao Tzu quote, and I'll paraphrase and butcher it here, but it's basically, you're stepping out of the way. Like the success is all of theirs. Like the leader that is almost non-existent when some version of success is achieved, the team feels like we did it ourselves. Now that makes all sense, but if you think of, well, what gets in the way of that? Well, we want to be needed. We want to be valued. There's these particular, maybe it connects a bit with the false self again, but this ego thing, we do have this desire to be seen in a certain way. And some of those things can obviously get in the way of that, our own desires for maybe it's an illusion of success, our own desire to be remembered and valued and things like that.
I love that. And so, like, what are practices that you've found that maybe are universal in some ways that help a person to at least get a glimpse of that space that you're talking about, that gain a sense of maybe there's a second guess on one's own motives, that you become self-aware? Because if you're going to disappear, you actually have to recognize that you've actually disappeared versus just thinking you are. So like, what are practices or tools that you might recommend folks to try out for a season?
I mean, I think a big one is one that you talk about, is some sort of stillness practice. I tend to think about it as just as I said, basically a stillness practice.
Yeah.
I sometimes worry about any sort of traditional meditation, centering prayer, whatever of these different versions there are, with some sort of set of rules. I sometimes worry about just our need to try to be successful, our desire to do something well. I think a good starting point and maybe a lot of value is just stillness, of just thinking about it as nowhere to go, nothing to do, simply practice stillness. And maybe after a year or so, that, or whenever someone feels comfortable, if they want a little more structure, if they want a system, whether centering prayer or something else, to put that into practice after some just stillness.
Yeah, it's really interesting you're saying that. I have the privilege Actually, it's later today. I'm going to record another episode in actually a couple hours after we're done. I'm speaking to James Bryan Smith, and he has a new book. It's called The Good and Beautiful You. And what's fascinating is he's trying to help a person. He has a whole trilogy of books that go before that, but this is his fourth one. He's talking about essentially being able to become the person that God created you to be. And he does I don't know, I'm trying to think if he uses the language of false self, true self. I think he does. He's talking about you becoming your true self. And he has a series of practices because the book's meant to be read in the community. And it's interesting. The very first of his spiritual practices is holy leisure, which what he meant was it was silence and solitude with no goal attached to it. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to do this 20-minute centering prayer so that I can grow spiritually. It's literally, you could do anything you wanted as long as there was no goal or or work on the other side of it. And I think I just kind of heard you saying that, which is really interesting.
And if you think about it, that is also difficult. It's
Yeah.
even just to sit still for 10 minutes, say, I'm going to sit still for the next 10 or 20 minutes. You find a place, you will still face resistance. Just like that quote from Blaise Pascal talks about, of that being basically kind of the root of the problem is our inability. You still face that. And I tend to think of not only how do you do something, but what might be the obstacles that get in the way of doing that. And I think sometimes some sort of structure, you might have to remember the rules of how do you do this. And then this thing, especially if you're initially starting, you might have that inner critic talking about, well, I didn't do that well. How do we remove maybe some of those obstacles? And I still think there may be a benefit. I had a person on the podcast, Kevin Griffin, if I remember his name, but long time meditation teacher and things like that. And I heard him say on another podcast that he thinks that maybe it's the stillness that does the work, not necessarily all of these particular this or that. There's so many different types of meditation, and obviously there's something to that. I mean, I don't know if he holds onto that super strongly, but something to think about, that maybe there's benefit of just stillness.
I love that. I think that's going to be a big takeaway from this conversation, the way you just articulated that so well. So thank you very much. I'm curious about your Instagram account. And I think you also put it out on Twitter, but I mostly see your stuff on Instagram. And I just find myself like pasting your quotes. I don't know how many I've shared now. I just love them because it's like you literally just have almost a stream of things coming out on Instagram. I don't even know if I see every one that comes out. So how do you actually, from a nuts and bolts perspective, again, I'm thinking there's some people here listening that they're trying to do social media at their church, trying to get good messages out. And you, again, your social media, to me, I would tell anybody to follow it because it's always positive, it's always helpful, and it's pointing people in my way to the deepest truths. And I think when you're pointing people to the deepest truths, I mean, that's the ultimate blessing that we can do with our own lives. So how do you do it? How do you get all this stuff to just roll through your accounts all the time and have time to even put all those quotes together? Is there a secret behind all that, or?
Well, that's probably too kind of you. And for the listeners, maybe lower the expectations a bit if you're going there to check it out. But it's really a few posts a day of, I would say mostly philosophical quotes that are coming from the Path newsletter that we put out weekly, or quotes from podcast episodes like you coming on. I go through and pick out a memorable quote from the conversation, and that's pretty much it. But just things that have stuck with me over the years. Some of these quotes have been a little collection probably over the last decade or so that are hopefully short and memorable. But I think there's a lot of value in a short, concise truth. And sometimes it can be an entry point into whatever that particular path may be. I think there are people that maybe come in by way of a philosophical wisdom tradition and find themselves on the Christian path, seeing that. I think you can come into some of these things and the wisdom from Jesus makes more sense. You can really see it as this, beautiful teaching, this beautiful wisdom and way of life.
So share a little bit. I mean, I know like one of the things I liked about Seneca's letters, and you mentioned this, Seneca kind of models, he'll throw a quote in at the end. He always, and and it's funny, he'll even share from like Epicurus. He said, he's like, what's he even say? He steals from the enemy or however he said, I don't think he calls, maybe, I don't think he uses that strong a language, but it's kind of funny. He'll tell you a quote and do a little thing on it. So many people love quotes, but you seem like you've been a collector. And so just curious, how do you have an organizing system to your quotes so that you can pull things, you put them in categories, or do you literally just have a bunch on a piece of paper and you kind of share them as you find them?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's very organized, but I use Canva to create it. So basically, once you put it in there, it's there. So once you get a little collection, of content that you want to put out, it's a cycle. If you get 100, you can post and then kind of start from the beginning and add as you go, delete as you go. But I would say it's not very organized initially, other than basically what's in there in terms of posting content.
That's good. Well, it's just to show them its commitment and continuing to work on it. So, if I was going to ask you, and again, I didn't send this question, I'm just curious. I mean, like, what are two or maybe one or two of your favorite quotes that come to mind that that you think about a lot, or maybe you've shared the most, or you found the most meaningful in your life?
There's one that I probably found within the last couple of years, from Reinhold Neubar, and I may have pronounced his last name incorrectly, but also known for the Serenity Prayer and things like that. But he says forgiveness is the final form of love.
Wow. Yeah.
And I am big on forgiveness these days, the wisdom of forgiveness. I just don't necessarily think it's talked about as much as it should be. And I love in your book towards the end, you really stress the importance of forgiveness. But it's a skill that we have to cultivate and think about. And there's people that have come before us that provide wisdom that can help us to be more forgiving and live more peaceful lives.
That's a great quote. And I just have a few more questions for you. And these are more questions I do like to ask my guests. This first one is, I don't know, this could be as audacious as you want it to be, but now that since you've said what a perennial leader is, maybe it'll be hard to answer. But if your future really would unfold according to your goals, your dreams, maybe even your sense of where God is guiding you, or this wisdom path is guiding you, where do you hope to end up? Say, again, I have no idea how old you are, either like 20, 25 years from now, could be 10 years. I mean, what's your kind of long-term goal in the work that you do, Josh?
Well, I'm 43 now. It's a tough question for me to answer, really. It's I don't necessarily think too much in that way today. But I'll tell you, I feel like I've been extremely blessed, married to a wonderful woman, two great kids, so fortunate to have been able to have a career in the military and things like that, and retired, and the flexibility to search for wisdom, if you will. It's a real privilege in my mind. So I hope to be a blessing, I guess. If you're some way, if you've been blessed, be a blessing. I hope that maybe someday this particular thing that I'm doing, if it continues, and who knows, I don't necessarily hold things too tightly, but if it continues, I hope to maybe raise some money for charity and things like that, and hopefully, acts for the common good.
I love that. I love that. So what's a typical day look like for you, just in terms of maybe how you structure, I guess, a typical work day, I guess, and hopefully you just take some days off and you're not doing anything other than hanging out with the family and stuff. But what's a
Yeah.
typical day look like for you in terms of habits, and what do you use to keep yourself so grounded?
Um, well, I have a bit of a routine in terms of practices that I have been with for a bit and will probably continue for a while. And that is journaling. I'm a fan of journaling like you are. I'm also a huge fan of daily readers.
Yeah.
I have a pile of daily readers that I rotate through. Henry Nouwen's right here that I just picked up, and we'll go through and read that and then do a bit of journaling, looking at the previous day. And from a journaling perspective, I like the idea of these, as the Stoics talk about, of looking at from a second person, I guess, if you will, just kind of observing it, examining your day, maybe against the cardinal virtues, theological virtues, or these perspectives on life, whether it be this connection type of thing that we've talked about, or impermanence, or beginner's mind, but something where you're have some objective stuff to evaluate, in a kind way, how yesterday went. And then already talked about a bit of stillness. And then I'm a big walker. I live around some woods, and sometimes I walk and listen to audio, but a lot of times maybe just some deliberate, conscious walking, not necessarily for exercise, but more for peace of mind.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Yeah, I do a lot of walking just without any noise at all, and just kind of take it in just to try to get that expanse. And then, sometimes I'll record something, but I love just to walk and just to listen, and it's so good. So
Yeah.
that's awesome. Outside of I guess the Bible, which again we haven't talked about much in this episode, but I mean, other than what it would be like 2 or 3 books that you've shaped you deeply, that when you think, wow, I'm so glad I read these 2 or 3 books at some point in my life.
One would be Meditations by Marcus Aurelius that I already mentioned.
Yeah, for sure.
There's some real wisdom in there, but also just this idea of it being someone's journal
That's cool.
Just a really cool format. Another one, which I think is not so common, is Awareness by Anthony DeMello. Have you ever
I just literally, I have like 2 chapters left. I've been reading that right now. It's a remarkable book.
I've probably read that book more than any other book that I've read. And the interesting thing, that has another, I think, kind of cool format, is because it was a retreat that he did. So it's not edited up like a traditional book would be. It's just basically him talking. If you can actually find if they're still on there, the YouTube videos of him doing it from the 80s or 90s or whatever it is. But yeah, it's not edited at all. It's just him straight shooting, very direct, and sometimes some harsh truths in there. But yeah, I really, really enjoy that.
Yeah, that is an interesting book. And it's just funny you said that, because I'm literally, like, I just have a couple of pages up on that thing. I've been slowly digesting it this year, because that is a remarkable book. And you're right, he writes, well, Aurelius does it too, because Aurelius is writing to himself, so it sounds like he's talking to you. And then and DeMello does exactly the same thing, because he's actually talking to an audience, so it does come off direct. That's really interesting. I'm curious on Meditations, and you may not know it. I mean, to me, this is my personal take, and I know Ryan Holiday wouldn't agree with this. Other people, I find that one the hardest to read out of the 3 big Stoics, and I don't know if it's the translation. And I've bought 3 different translations of Marcus Aurelius. Do you know which one you prefer? It's the one that has a little cardinal on the cover, maybe, if you have the. And if you don't know that off the top of your head, it seems like translation makes a big difference with Aurelius.
Well, there's a new one that came out, the most recent one that has a commentary to it, I think is really, really good. I think it's by Waterfield is the translator. Okay. But also the one with the black cover on it that has the little cardinal on it is also, I think, a good translation, but it is weird. They are very different. Like I
Yeah.
pulled up the public domain um, ones, and it's yeah, it's just a different language. It doesn't, yeah.
Yeah, that was my pain too. The public domain one was just almost unreadable, but I'm going to check out the Waterfield one too. So I'm going to link all this to the notes for anybody that's listening, because in some cases translations always make a big deal, but I think with
Yeah.
the meditations, it's a big thing. Is there a third book, or were those the two books that you wanted to share? I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, could I mention a new one
Yeah.
that people may not be familiar with, but I think some listeners would enjoy is the Good Life Method. It's written by a couple professors, and they created the God and the Good Life course at Notre Dame. And it's this interesting thing of tackling this, what is the good life, from a philosophical perspective, but also from a Christian perspective as well. So I think it's an interesting book, a needed book, and there may be some listeners that enjoy that.
Thank you. And then the last question, how can listeners who are interested in you now best connect with you, and also talk a little bit about the coaching services that you provide and what maybe an ideal client would look like for you?
Oh, cool. Well, thanks for that. It's I think the best way is probably just give Perennial Leader Project a Google. It's perennialleader.com. You can check out what I'm up to in the way of articles, and a little weekly newsletter that we put out, and podcasts and all that type of stuff. For coaching, I coach very few, definitely never more than 2 or 3 at a time. An ideal person might be someone looking to create a little greater awareness. I mean, definitely, as you know, any coaching thing is completely self-directed. It's whatever that individual is particularly looking for. But I guess in the way of, Socratic questioning and things like that, somebody that is looking to maybe get some questions that might broaden a perspective, and maybe hopefully create a little more clarity and meaning in someone's life.
I love that. Well, Josh, I want to thank you for being you, for honoring the gifts
Appreciate it.
that God's given to you, and honoring that curiosity that you have, and then sharing so much wonderful content with the world. And I appreciate you taking some time today to speak with me and the audience here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on. It's good to connect again.
Yeah, it is. And thanks everyone for listening all the way to the end of this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. Until next time, show up, pay attention. God's got way more invested in you than even you do. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you found this episode helpful, would you please share it with friends through your social media networks, as well as leaving a review to help other people find it? If you're interested in any of the resources mentioned, please check out the show notes. And let me again remind you, if you're interested in contemplative practices, my latest book, Centering Prayer, Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life, is now available in paperback or on Kindle. Recommend ordering it off of Amazon. If you want to do a large order, I would reach out directly to Paraclete Press. Ask for Sister Estelle, and you can get some deep discounts if you're interested in buying, say, any quantity of at least 3 or more copies. You can get good discounts directly from Paraclete. Thank you so much for the privilege of serving you, and we'll see you next time.